Welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great honor to have you today with us. You've got extensive experiences with community building. And as I may mention, you are the founding director of Chattanooga Endeavors and principal Grassroots Development.
That's right.
So when and how did you first get involved with community building, Tim?
Well, I like as an accident, I suppose, like most people. I think community building as an experience is such a difficult thing to articulate. There are not that many people that enter into a circle expecting what they're going to experience, at least not accurately. So I would say that really it was by accident. What had happened with me in particular, though, was that I was working on a very early model of a work readiness program for people that were returning home from prison. And up until that time, I had been mostly involved with residential programs. So I was pretty familiar with, and living in residential programs, I was familiar with residential community, but I wasn't familiar with the kind of community that people can experience in a community building workshop. There are similarities, but obviously a workshop model is much more organized than a live-in model. So what was evident to me at the time was that non-residential program was missing something, and I didn't exactly know what it was missing, but it was just missing something. The programs that we ran that were residential, that intentionally built a residential community, that operated with models of things like consensus and milieu therapy, and had other characteristics that were, sort of left over from the United States kind of communal movement. It was sort of left over from the 60s. But there was quite a bit that was learned inside those communes that were applicable to people that were in the field. It wasn't different from things that were learned from monastery experiences. Wasn't maybe necessarily all that different from things that you might read coming out of the Desert Fathers. So they're truths that have been around for a very long time that were resurfacing during the 60s, that were kind of captured in some models of things like consensus building and restorative justice and other things like that, that people were familiar with. And I guess I wasn't all that familiar with them outside of a residential community. So I lived at a halfway house my senior year at the University of Notre Dame. It was called Dismas House. It still exists in South Bend. It originally was started by a Catholic priest in Nashville back in the early 70s as an extension of the Vanderbilt University Prison Project. And that was my background. It was heavily influenced by the Mennonite community in Elkhart, Indiana, which was ground zero in the United States for restorative justice with Howard Zier's efforts and some other people there. And so those influences were all around me at Dismas House when I was living there. And then I established a similar program in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And then we expanded that program because it was successful and needed. We expanded the program to include a non-residential program. And that's when things started to fall apart for me, because I was looking for those same qualities that we built in the residential community to be in place in a classroom, and they just weren't. And so I was getting frustrated with the results that we were having. And we tried a lot of different things that made sense to us on paper, but in practice they didn't bear out. And then we were doing some work with Sister Helen Prejean, who's the nun from Dead Man Walking. She does a lot of death row work. And she lived right outside of New Orleans in a little community called Metairie. And she was familiar with the work of Bob Roberts. And so in the course of us working with her in Chattanooga, she mentioned Bob Roberts. And so I'm Catholic and she's a nun. And she made me promise to call him. So a good Catholic boy is not going to turn down a nun. I put it off as long as I could, I suppose. But then I gave him a call. And he proceeded to tell me about the work that he had done inside a prison in Louisiana as part of his PhD dissertation research. And he took what he learned inside prison and converted it into a non-residential program in New Orleans that was at the time associated with Tulane University. And it sounded, frankly, it sounded made up. I mean, the stories that he was telling me, I thought, well, he's just, sort of fudging this. And so I didn't really believe him, but then again, I didn't really know what he was talking about. He was using a language that I was unfamiliar with. And he could tell that. And eventually he said, hey, Dempsey, why don't you just come to New Orleans and go through a community building workshop and you'll see for yourself. So that's what I did. I got on a plane and went to Louisiana, showed up for this workshop, and Bob was not facilitating. It was some of his staff, and most of them were former offenders themselves. A couple of them had been part of the work that he was doing inside prison, and now they were released and they're working on a staff outside prison. And it was, I remember there were 64 participants. I kept on counting them, and there were 64 participants, and there was one other white participant. Everybody else was black, and they were mostly much older than me. And they were mostly born and raised in the New Orleans area. And so the culture was very different. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. And so there was kind of this collision of cultures in my mind. And there was this collision of ages. And there was a collision of races and everything else. I mean, it's like, I do not fit in this group. That was my impression. And so we spent, as you know, 3 days in a circle and did the community building thing. And it was not a standard workshop in the fact that Bob never really did run sort of conventional workshops. He had a sort of an aggressive style as a facilitator, and he taught that to his facilitators as well. So it didn't come off as aggressive to me at the time because I didn't have anything to compare it with. But by comparison, it was a kind of aggressive style. But we built community, and I just remember that experience of feeling like against all the odds, I belonged in this group, and I felt like I was a part of it. So that missing element that I was looking for, it occurred to me that it was the authenticity of the experience that was not at place in the residential program that I was trying to build. And I thought, well, gee, if I can, if that's what happens in these circles, if I can bring that to Chattanooga, then it can't probably hurt what we're trying to do. And so Bob worked with me directly, but then with some of our staff. And I say he trained us, but the training it felt a little bit like your grandfather throwing you into the lake, right, to teach you how to swim. I mean, he called it training, but he was basically pointing us in a direction. And I don't know if he did have confidence in me, it was totally unfounded, because I hadn't done anything to deserve it. But we came out swimming. I mean, we learned the method. I had a staff then that I trained mostly. Bob helped initially, but then I trained mostly. And we continued to do community building workshops in a prison reentry program that was non-residential, beginning with that element of authenticity for whatever, 15 or 20 years. We did a lot of community building workshops. We're holding them once a month, at one point twice a month for several years. So I got quite a bit of experience running community building workshops with people that had been incarcerated. And then eventually we brought in members from the community to participate as well, which expanded a little bit. But all of my experience with community building workshops were with people that had been incarcerated. And I didn't know at the time that there was anything like FCE. I mean, I was familiar with PECs. I guess I didn't read that last part of Different Drum to understand that FCE actually existed. And it not only existed, it existed right up the road from Chattanooga. I mean, Knoxville is an hour and a half away, and that's where FCE started. But I didn't know that it was there, and we just kept on doing our thing. We kept our heads down, and we realized that this was something that was really helpful in that environment, and so we integrated it into our program, and we ran it. It became a part of the culture for the staff, and so we had a organization that was really community centered. And not just a piece of an offering that was like a add-on, So I guess that's how I got involved with it. It was because I didn't personally think that I needed something. I mean, that wasn't I know a lot of people come to community building because they're looking for something personal. That wasn't my experience. I didn't feel like I needed something personally. I needed something to help me in the classroom, and so I was looking for a tool. Community building, I think I've come to realize, is definitely not a tool. I mean, that's not the way to take it on. But that's what was motivating me. So, yeah, that's the best I can do.
Okay, so did you actually read the Different Drum before, or as I understand, after you have tasted community building?
So I read the Different Drum while I was either just at Notre Dame or just left Notre Dame. I can't remember. I read the Different Drum way before we did community building. I liked a part. We used a residential sort of model for consensus building as a way to create sort of a democratic community at Dismas House that was intended to be a group of former offenders and college students. It was the college student aspect that made it very different. And so it was in South Bend, it was me and I think 7 or 8 other college students from Notre Dame, and about the same number of former offenders. And the intention was for the students. This is the way that I understand it. This was never really articulated by Dismas House. But what it felt like was that the students had to figure out how to first build a residential community, whatever that meant, and then to bring the former offenders into it in a way that the relationships and the power dynamics and the expectations and all the structures and so forth were all horizontal, right? That was really hard to do because the former offenders looked at us like they should be looking up to us. Many of the students looked at the former offenders like they should be looking down at them. So, you know, that relationship was really, the differential was really a problem initially, and trying to flatten that was really the problem that was needing to be solved in order for there to be a residential community there where everybody was a true stakeholder at a equal level, right? So that was tough. I read everything I could get my hands on, and it was all about. I mean, probably Bonhoeffer did more for me to help me understand that kind of residential community than anybody. There are other people I think were important as well. But you know, he talked about community from a very a faith perspective that was really important to me, and so I think a lot of his writing was in that context much more useful than Scott Peck's writing. But I was introduced to Scott Peck's Different Drum as, you know, part of that exploration, because that was the same community that I was trying to build in Chattanooga. And he had a line. We had every month we had, we called it a house meeting. So every month there was a management meeting, right? There were certain things that residents could not do, which, you know, had to do with things like fundraising and filing papers and making reports and these kind of things. But all of the residential community was left up to the residents to run. So we had a management meeting once a week. Everybody was required to be there. And we used consensus as a way to make decisions, which, I mean, and we were doing a true consensus model, which can be pretty tedious, right? And we started the meetings with a piece of the Different Drum, where Scott Peck says that communication is the bedrock of all human relationships, and that it should ultimately serve to lower or remove the barriers of misunderstanding that unduly separate us humans one from another. I remember that because we read it every week for like 5 years, or probably 10 years, I guess. And so it was just part of our nature. So Peck was there in that respect because, you know, I lifted a quote from his book that began every one of our house meetings for, like I say, probably 5 or 10 years. But, you know, the model of community building, what I thought, like a lot of people, well, does it have to be that long, right? And as I'm reading through the content, and maybe we can do community building, you know, on the cheap somehow, and you know, maybe we can use some of these methods, you know, in our house meeting. Maybe we can have a weekend retreat or something like that, build some other things into it. So I experimented with little things, but I didn't have a clue what community building actually was. So I wasn't really experimenting. I was just kind of lifting some ideas from his book to see how they would play out in our environment. And, you know, I think some things could have helped if I knew about them, you know, in our environment. I wasn't, you know, I wasn't that familiar with his model to be able to figure out how to actually implement them. Now we do that now. We take elements from the community building model and, you know, little pieces of community building, part of the method, and we'll try to embed them. I say we, I mean me and whoever else, but you know, we'll try to embed them in the formal structure of an organization. I mean, that's what we did with Chattanooga Endeavors. We took elements of, so for instance, every meeting always starts with silence, and it's always an invitation to set aside your distractions. I mean, we always do that. There's always somebody that's looking, you know, sort of on the lookout for chaos. And so if there are symptoms or signs of chaos in a meeting, there's always an opportunity to stop the meeting and deal with the chaos. So we always say, so you can do those things. You can take those little elements of the method and embed them in the formal structure of the organization so that over time, the organization becomes more like a community. So we do that now, but back then, I can't say that I was just flying by the seat of my pants, Tim. I didn't really know what I was doing, and if I had been exposed to a community building workshop at the time, don't think that it would have made sense given what we were trying to do in the residential work. The timing for me was, how do you do this in a non-residential setting? That's what was important to me. And this was the answer for that for me for a long time.
All right, you have said a lot of interesting things I didn't know about. The question that struck me, that came up to me is that, could you actually reach consensus without the community building model?
Sure, yeah. Consensus is in a very fundamental way, consensus just means that everybody feels like their concerns have been heard. I mean, people approach consensus in all kinds of different ways, but fundamentally that's what it is. And so that the techniques and the methods and the rules and whatever else that are part of that experience in making a decision all have to do with that. Let's make sure that everybody has had their concerns heard and that the decision represents that, right? So yeah, you can reach consensus if you're careful, and if the person that's in charge is sort of naturally authentic in that kind of a way, right? So I don't think you can reach. You can't, somebody that is using consensus as as a tool to try to get deeper engagement with the workers or something like that. I mean, that's fake, right? That's inauthentic, and it's manipulative. So for people that are using consensus as a way to build greater buy-in because that's what they need, because it improves their annual report or something like that, then it's not going to work. But community building won't work in that context either. So yeah, I think you can certainly get to, but it all depends on the person that is sort of navigating the group. And also in a lot of ways depends on the group itself. I mean, consensus is not a model that works for everybody. It just, it can be disrespectful to a group that is not in a place where they either understand or appreciate, or they've got different. I mean, you have to really buy into something pretty deeply for you to invest the kind of time that consensus needs, right? And if it's a secondary priority for you, consensus doesn't make that much sense. Like if you're just trying to get to a decision at a neighborhood association, about whether or not you should build a bigger fence around the pool. I mean, so it doesn't really, for a lot of people, this is not an important decision. It's not fundamental to them. They don't have the time to invest in it. They just want an efficient way to get to a decision. And they're happy if they want to vote, majority rules and just keep on going. So I think, you got to match, just like community building. You've got to match the model with the circumstances. Otherwise, you're likely to get the wrong result, or at least the method will backfire in some kind of a way. So.
All right. My next question would be, maybe I need to modify it, but in what ways have you been involved over the years? I understand you have been working with former offenders, but as I know, you have also been involved with introducing community building into organizations. Is that right?
Yeah. So I have done mostly work with former offenders, but then Ed Grudy and I took on the work that Bob Roberts was doing in New Orleans, and that became Community Building Milwaukee. So I was involved with the work there for, I guess, 4 years. And I have worked with a couple of other organizations. I continue, I'll do training. I'll never charge for training ever again. But I will do training with organizations that want to use community, where it makes sense, first of all, and that want to use community building in a kind of through and through way. I mean, I won't do community building training with somebody who just wants to learn how to facilitate and then, do public workshops. I'm not really into that, and that's not really my background or expertise. It's just not what I'm good at. But if you've got a service, if somebody has a service organization that has a staff that wants to learn how to do this model and make it a part of their overall offering, then I will teach them how to do that safely in a social, a human services setting, and then also how to, think kind of forward through their organizational setting so that they can find other places where they can, as we were talking about before, embed those elements of community building in their formal structure. There is some really interesting research I remember seeing in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Excuse me. And it made a case for what the authors were referring to as expressive organizations. And as they were describing an expressive organization, they thought, well, that's a community-centered organization. I mean, I'm familiar with that territory. That's a community-centered organization all day long. What was interesting about it was that they said, organizations where the staff are expressive basically around their personal lives, well, those organizations do better than organizations that have staffs that are not expressive about their personal lives. And organizations that are expressive about their professional life, what they're working on together, they do better than organizations that are not expressive about their work life. But the organizations that have staffs that are expressive both about their personal life and their work life, well, they do something very unique. And when you walk in the door for an organization like that, you feel the difference. You literally feel the difference. The culture sort of invades you. And so you feel like you're at a place that's very different than you are at an organization that's not like that. And the thing that was interesting about me was that, to me, was that the authors didn't exactly know how to recreate that. And I thought, well, you're describing a community-centered organization, and community building as a method enables you to recreate that, right? So what they were saying was, they were saying that organizations like community building, if you can make them like this, they'll do much better than organizations that are not, much better. And so, yeah, I think that to me, when I see an organization that's like that, I'm happy to try to help in some ways. I've got a couple of conversations with a couple of organizations right now that are like that. One is in Seattle, the other one is around Knoxville.
They are like that, or they want to become like that?
They want to become like that. There are no more. That's the thing, Tiff. I mean, it's like, there are a couple of organizations in Milwaukee that I think that their cultures were conducive to community building prior to them using the model, but the model has helped with that. So there are a couple of organizations there that I think, would sort of qualify in that respect. But overall, there are just not that many organizations in the United States that you can say, have taken the community building model and built it into their culture. I know it's a frustration for a lot of people, and everybody's got their own ideas about why that is. It's like, well, this model works so well, why is it not used, more frequently with more organizations, and I think the answers are, there are 1,000 answers to that question, but The fact that you just can't, avoid is that it's not. It's a model that does work, and it's been demonstrated to work, and it's worked. I personally have personal experience with it working, but it's not used. So that kind of a problem, suggests a question or two, but those are the facts, and why that is, I don't really know. The model's hard to teach. It takes a lot of time to teach, but other models are hard to teach and take a lot of time to teach. It's fully focused on process, and so it doesn't have specific content, but there are other methods that are fully focused on process that don't have content. So there are a lot of reasons why that might be the case, but I don't think that there's any really good, to me anyhow, any good compelling answer to that. It just is the case. I can talk kind of. I'll give you my one mystical answer, and it's this: you don't bully community building. If you are doing community building in a way to improve outcomes, or to improve culture, or to get a better result on your reports, or to drive income, or to drive this or drive that or drive that, if you're using community building in what might be considered a manipulative way, not that it's bad manipulation, but in a way to achieve something else, if it's not just for community building resists it. So I think in some ways that is sort of the answer, that if you're using community building to achieve something except for community, right, then I think maybe community just frankly resists it. It doesn't like to be bullied. So the spirit doesn't like to be bullied.
The leader who does that doesn't have the spirit of emptiness within him or herself, and then it doesn't really work, is it?
True. However, I've known people that they can get to emptiness, in a very deep way, that then once they've had that experience, they want to turn around and use it for something else. I think it's extremely common for people to have that experience. So their first time in a community building workshop, they have that experience of emptiness, and what follows that experience of emptiness, I mean, it's very, whatever it is, it's very, the experience of emptiness is extraordinarily personal. What follows that experience of emptiness also is extraordinarily personal, and it's hard to explain for people. But then you see a lot of people leaving community building workshops wanting to do this in that context, or in this organization, or to achieve that result, or with this project. I mean, you see all these people, leaving the workshop with all these ways that they want to apply community building. Now they experienced emptiness, and it was, authentic emptiness to them. But then there was something about, wanting to hand it on, and wanting to move it out, and wanting it to do this, that, or the other thing. But I think when you put community building to work in that way, you got to be really careful. You got to be really, really careful that you're not putting community building to work in a way that it doesn't want to be used. But that's not a satisfactory answer to me about why it's not used in more places. I think it's also true that it was, in some ways, it was a model for its time, and its time is somewhat past. And so part of the question to me is, well, how do you take what we've learned in community building and position that in a way that you have the same experience now? I mean, COVID has made people extraordinarily aware of the fact that we're not connected. Like, there is this thing that's missing. Well, thing that's missing. Scott Peck talks about it all the time. It's the experience of community. And so people are aware that they're missing something in their lives. And I think it's up to somebody like you to figure out, how do you make community building available now for people that, are hungry for something, but they don't exactly know what it is. But you know what it is. And other people that have had community building experiences know what it is.
Okay. What are some important steps when introducing community building into an existing organization?
I think fundamentally it has to come in from the top. It's maybe not, it's not, I think, like the popular thing to say nowadays, but I think it's true that if the person in charge doesn't have a natural affinity for community building, then I think that it's not going to work, and it's not going to prevail. I think it's also true that you can't use community building as a kind of a one-off experience for people. It's not a workshop to have. So I think that that's true also. I think that it's got to be careful with for-profit organizations and with governmental organizations. The motivation for people to work for nonprofits or non-governmental organizations or just human service providing organizations, the motivation is very different. And we engage with our quote unquote clients in a different kind of a way. The staff is more positioned in a way that's open to these experiences, whereas you put some people from a private corporation into a workshop, and they're sitting, in the circle. I remember when somebody says, "Well, it's really hard for me to be honest in this circle when the person that signs my paycheck is sitting right next to me," right? And that's true in so many different ways. When you're sitting in a circle with your colleagues at a company that generally speaking is driven by competitiveness, where everybody's measured and evaluated, where you don't know when you say something that may make you look vulnerable if that's going to be used against you. So in a for-profit company, I would say it's much less likely that community building is a fitting model in its traditional sense. You can teach, I think, managers how to manage from a place of emptiness. So, and I think that the people that they would be supervising, their direct reports, I think would have a very different experience of their supervisor that is likely to produce better results. I think that that's probably true. So I think one way into private corporations are through the management structures, so that those one-on-ones that they have with their directs are more productive. But I think when you start circling people up that are hypersensitive to being evaluated all the time, that stands in the way of community building all day long. And I think it's unfair. I remember talking with somebody that did this in a for-profit company for a long time. And he said that, essentially renegotiated their contract. I mean, without saying it out loud, it sort of renegotiated their contract so that where they came into the organization thinking that they would be evaluated on, these few domains, now all of a sudden they're also evaluated on how vulnerable they are. Right? And so that's not necessarily a work dimension. And so he said that ultimately, I mean, it started for him, it started out good and it ended bad. And I think that that's something to be very cautious about. So when you're talking about organizations, I would personally, I think that in the nonprofit community, you're more likely to find organizations that are conducive to community building than in the for-profit or the governmental sectors. And inside those organizations, I think you need to have somebody at the top that is committed to this in more than a superficial way. And I think you can't just do workshops. I think you need to teach people how to use some of the community building skills, and take those skills then, and like I've said a number of times here, kind of embed them into the formal structure of the organization, so that you're working, in a more of a through and through way with an organization, rather than just exposing people to community building. So, and then, you gotta, with organizations, you got to figure out, well, is this something that is good for the clients that you're serving, or is it good for the staff, or is it good for the leadership, or so there are a lot of considerations then, I think, in terms of how you apply and who you apply with, and what the long-term plan is, and so forth. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? I'm kind of wandering around.
A lot of aspects to take into consideration. But even in a for-profit company, do you think a CEO, a top-level manager, could benefit from the listening skills that he could gain through community building?
I think
For example, there are other.
I think that in a for-profit company, that managers in particular could gain a lot from learning how to see. It's not, to me, it's not just listening. I mean, and it's not just speaking. There is a depth of authenticity that happens that comes off to the person speaking, comes off to that person as feeling heard. So I give you a kind of an example of that. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this in a community building workshop, that oh, I can't believe that I said, I've never said that to anybody all of my life. So I heard that in prison workshops for quite a while. They were post-prison workshops, but they're with people that had just gotten out of prison, for quite a while. And then it occurred to me one day, after somebody said something like that, I said, "Well, that may be true, but how did I know it then? Like, you said something that I already knew, and you said you've never said it to anybody." And then it occurred to me, oh yeah, it was in the person's institutional file. I had read it. Well, if I had read it, clearly he said it to somebody else. So he said it to somebody else. It was in their jacket. He said it to all kinds of people then, right? So it wasn't true that he hadn't ever said it to anybody before. What was true was that he had never felt heard by anybody. So the same story coming off over and over and over and over and over again never really felt like it landed anywhere. Right. Well, that was the experience that he had in community building. So the workshop prepared that time for him where he was able to say something, and it landed in a way that he felt respected and heard and acknowledged. And, like there was actually somebody there that authentically was not judging them. Right. So, you get into these situations and people are judgmental all day long, right? It's like, it's the nature of things. And so it's hard to, not have the experience of being judged. But in this context, he said something, it landed in a way that he didn't feel like it was judged. Now, so can you, recreate that for people in a supervising setting? Well, it's a real challenge, right? So, because you have to hold people accountable, but you also want to make sure that they've been heard. So it's kind of back to that consensus model you were asking about before. Yeah, so you can build consensus. but it takes some time. And you also have to get the work done at the same time, right? So community building is not about doing anything in particular, but it can set the stage for something to be done. And a supervisor can certainly engage in a relationship where they are attending to the person in front of them. They're undistracted by other things that are going on. They're actually listening to that person. The person has the experience of feeling like they are the attention for the supervisor in the moment, right? So that they're actually being respected. So yeah, I think that that's really true, and especially for supervisors nowadays. I mean, managers are just, they're overwhelmed with work. They're just rifling through people. People in the workforce today are basically processed like chickens on a conveyor belt. You just move them. So I just heard something not long ago about the accident rates with on Amazon's workforce, and they're very high. They're twice the rate of other fulfillment industry companies, and the speculation is that that's because they drive efficiency so much. They're making people work so fast that they're making mistakes. That's true all over the place. We're working so fast that there's just not the time to have that experience with another person where you feel like you're in an authentic space and you're actually being heard. But I think you can do that in a rapid moving workforce just like you can in one that's not, but it takes a very skillful supervisor. So yeah, to answer your question, I think you can. It's not just about listening, it's about being present, right? And if you can teach a supervisor how to be present on the fly, you gotta, they have this phrase they use here. I don't know if you've heard it, but they call it teaming. Have you heard the phrase teaming?
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, so it's not, they don't make teams for long term much anymore in many American workforces. They assemble teams on the fly. And so they expect you to go through the team building process very rapidly and finish a project then very rapidly as a team. So they call it teaming. So, people are expected to team very effectively or very, very efficiently, in kind of a fast moving environment. And I think that, if groups can team quickly, I think that also individual managers can learn how to attune and be present quickly, right, in the moment, and not compromise, what it is they're responsible for, which is holding people accountable to some kind of an output, right?
Okay, if you could say just one thing about why to use community building with former offenders, what would it be as a closing closure?
Well, I'll repeat something that Bob Roberts used to say, is that community building creates the space for them to deal with grief. And there's so much grief that has been built up in their experience of life over the years, because they mostly come from very difficult backgrounds. But there's so much grief that is piled up over the years that it's really hard for them to do anything. But if you can deal with that grief, and if you can get that at least somehow partially out of the way, well, then you can do just about anything. So I think there's a lot to that. I don't know that that's entirely true, but I think that there is a lot to that. And when you give people an experience of feeling human again, which has been robbed from them. The experience of incarceration dehumanizes people just about like nothing else. And when you give them that experience in a circle, or however you're doing it, when you give that experience of feeling human again, you can do just about anything. So it's up to us to make those kind of experiences available for people that have been incarcerated. And I think that it's one of the unique things that community building can do. There are other models that can do it, but I think community building does it in a deeper and more efficient and more predictable way.
All right. So thank you again so much for taking the time. Maybe we do another episode and talk about facilitation in the future. I don't know.
Sure. You tell me. I'm happy to do whatever you want.